Being here. I'm Mike Kanin. I publish the Austin Monitor. This is the first panel of today. I called it, so I take the blame for the bad pun here. Stranger with some new land, and this is, I think a lot of you who followed the Grove issue will recognize the sort of description here, but I will remind everybody that this is not necessarily a panel just about the Grove. There's a significant amount of state property out there. But before we get to that, I'll have you all introduce yourselves and talk about your roles in thinking about the way that the city uses land. So, sure. Mr. Oliver.
Hi, good morning. My name is Stephen Oliver. I'm chair of the City Planning Commission, local architect. Been here since 1994, so seen a lot of change.
Morning, everybody.
Oh, got to switch it on there. There you go.
Is it on now? Okay, we're going to go on this one. This one's hot. I'm Leslie Poole, and I am the council member for District 7, which is kind of north central Austin. You all know where District 7 is. Thank you.
And I'm Robert Thomas. I'm an proud Austin resident, and I am the chairman of the Texas Facilities Commission.
And Mr. Thomas, I think we're going to start with you because this isn't just a panel about the Grove, and I'll probably not say that too much more. Let's give us an idea, if you could, of how much state property is out there, and at least to the extent that you're aware of it, and how much you guys might be looking to sell.
Well, I can answer the first generally. Okay. There's a lot of state property. Because we're the state, the Travis County is the state capital. Mm-hmm. As you're aware, we have state property throughout the county, actually, and the region specifically. As to how much we're willing to sell, that really is not, or that's available to sell. There's no list that says we have X number of properties that are available to sell in Austin or anywhere else in the state. Mm-hmm. Rather, we have a list of currently used properties, and then the Facilities Commission specifically is responsible for detailing the state of the facilities on our properties. Mm-hmm. To evaluate what the legislature may and the leadership may want to do vis-a-vis those properties, either updating, remodeling, or utilizing for future purposes. So I wouldn't say, I'd say specifically we don't have a list that says these are the ones that we know we're going to do something with, liquidate those assets. Mm-hmm. But we're always in a state of keeping up to date on what state those properties are in.
Okay, and real quickly, from the state's perspective, what is the benefit to making a land sale?
Well, generally speaking, I guess the benefit of a land sale is if there were an opportunity to utilize, well, let's back up. So obviously we've all been reading that tax revenues to the state have been tighter because of the drop in oil revenue. Mm-hmm. So we as the state are constantly in anticipation of our next budget cycle, what if funds are going to be available for what purposes. Some of those purposes or some of those needs are obviously for state facilities for our various agencies or so mm-hmm. The benefit of selling a property obviously would be if the sale of a property would generate enough revenue that would be able to offset or compensate or quite frankly substantially be utilized to build a replacement facility.
Gotcha. That all established, council member, what happens? Actually, I'm sorry. Let's start with you, Stephen, because you see it first, and then the council member will see it. What starts the process for the transformation of a land from a state-owned piece of land to say to a privately held property?
Well, I mean, in the case of state-owned land, these are unzoned pieces of land. So unzoned. If they're not in the central core of Austin, which many of the cases that we've been talking about are, but mm-hmm. if they're not in a neighborhood planning area, they're not going to be seen by the planning commission. They will go. They'll go to the zoning and planning commission, which is typically dealing with areas outside the urban core of Austin, or what we've seen is 1/3 of the city land area has been accumulated as part of neighborhood plans in the last 20 years. If it is in those areas, say like the Brackenridge tract or others like that, those would be seen by the Planning Commission, and there would be, there'd be a very intensive, probably long road of planning discussions of what is the vision for this property. Is that the right time for that discussion to take place? I would argue no. I think we need to be much more proactive at looking at what is the impact down the road, because ultimately what we don't want to have happen is we don't have the infrastructure to support the vision that may be on the table. And if you want the infrastructure to support it so that maybe it's X amount, bigger than what it could handle today because we're not trying to sprawl, then in that case, you got to start early, and that's not when the land is up for sale.
Okay. And Councilmember, and we'll touch back on those points. Councilmember, after it goes through planning or zoning and plating, it ends up on the dais, and you guys sort of talk about it. What does that mean for the property? What could folks expect if, say, they're a developer trying to get something done? What can they expect to see from council with something like that?
First, I want to make sure this mic is on.
Is it?
Is the mic working?
Sounds
it is.
good.
Okay,
It is.
great,
Okay.
thanks. So it's a multi-pronged and many-step process that gets a piece of land and a plan to the council. And I think if I can just emphasize a piece that Stephen was talking about, the further out that the council and the city and the various land use commissions and our staff can be looking at changing the face of our community and where we have infrastructure and what is the zoning on tracts of land, then the more predictable it is for developers to come in and say, well, that part of the city, they're looking at this for that, and it's not that the city can require a matchup, but there could be more alignment. Neighborhoods in the area would be advised earlier on what is expected, and then if we have land zoned for a particular, at a particular level for a particular thing, then that sets the early stages of the conversation that happen at the commission and the staff level with the applicants, and then by the time it gets to the council, many of the burrs under the saddle, perhaps you might say, have been kind of worked out and eased out, and the landscape is a lot more exposed, so you can see what the plans are, and when council makes the policy decisions, because that's where we're at, then the issues are lined up and have been investigated and debated and discussed, and then we have the feedback from the community in a larger amount, so that making the decision is more in line with what the community is looking for.
Okay. And is it safe to say from your perspective that has not happened? Let's talk about the Grove. Did that happen with the Grove? Was the process involved with the Grove something that worked for you?
Right. The land still isn't zoned.
Okay, fair point.
So, and unfortunately,
Okay.
that land still isn't zoned, and so we are looking at, and the Mayor Pro Tem and I have had some conversations for more than a year, and with some of the land use commissions about and the staff, and trying to move that forward so that we're not in the same predicament that we're in now. Again, it's predictability and what you can expect, and just to have a baseline starting place, and then you build on that.
Mr. Thomas, you're hearing early on here. You're hearing some frustrations from I think city folks here who have to sort of deal with the aftermath of an unzoned piece of land or even a zoned piece of land, sort of going through the process. Is there anything that you would like to see at the state level? Any sort of changes that might make this easier on a municipality?
Well, obviously, let me back up. First and foremost, I don't believe it's appropriate for the state to be involved in zoning decisions. I think that is local control issues, and I think that it's appropriately left to the elected officials and their processes to define the highest and best use of a piece of property within their municipality.
Sure.
That having been said, I know that Senator Watson was involved in some legislation to try to, and I apologize, I don't remember the details of the legislation, but to try to give local entities a bit more say, or at least more involvement when a piece of property is determined, a state piece of property is determined that's going to be put on the market for sale. So I think that there is a sensitivity and an appreciation from the state level to those issues. Simultaneously, again, with the foundation being, I don't personally believe it's appropriate for the state to interfere with those particular zoning issues. It's also critically important to remember that the state owns this land in the city of Austin, since we're particularly talking about Austin and our issues here, owns that land for the benefit of all citizens across the entirety of the state, and have an obligation to utilize those assets in a way to optimize for the benefit of all citizens. So I think that respectfully identifies that there's some level of sovereignty that the state has to maintain in its evaluation or analysis of how to process and deal with its asset for all of us across the state of Texas.
What does that specifically mean for, say, the residents of the city of Austin?
What does it specifically mean? Well, I think that it means that appropriately the state defers to the local elected officials and their commissions to define the process that they wish to go through to deal with the zoning issues associated with those pieces of property. I think it also becomes incumbent, as I think Councilmember Poole already has done, at least in one instance that I'm aware of engaging prospectively with the state on discussions associated with possibilities and potentialities. The earlier discussions start, the more success we could potentially have in crafting a solution that meets, optimizes everyone's needs. Unfortunately, all too often, I find, both as a very long-term resident of Austin and someone who's been engaged in the political process locally, as well as statewide, that unfortunately, sometimes decisions are made and then the state is told what the decision is. And that may or may not either fit in the time frame available to the state decision makers, because unfortunately it's legion. And it also may be inconsistent with at least theoretical planning that may have been ongoing related to adjacent properties, if not the property. And so it creates a false, I believe, it creates a false chasm, or it creates a chasm that shouldn't have been created, that would allow us, if we had the discussions early on, again, not suggesting that everybody would be satisfied with the solution, but we, at least by having those discussions prospectively and early on, we might be able to address some of those issues.
Councilmember, I see you're nodding your head there. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think the overarching point that Mr. Thomas is making that I agree with is that when, especially in governmental entities where we have a nexus of interest, or like a physical nexus and a boundary, and we know that there are moving pieces and things are happening, I agree. The earlier we talk about it and the more fearless we are about engaging our brother and sister governmental entities in these issues, even if at the starting point we feel like we're really far apart. You don't really know how far apart you are unless you can unpack it all, and I think that point is really well taken. I think this council is trying, a number of us have some work experience at the Capitol and in state government, and I think bringing that to the table as a council member has been really helpful, because we've been on the other side of that table, and knowing what is it like to work in state government or in the legislature and have the issues come to you, and you know what that feels like, and now we're at the city table looking at it this way, and so I have empathy for what the different policy decisions, and we think we have a length of time and obstacles at the city, but the state is even larger and things are more deliberative at the state, and I respect that. And so, and so for folks who think that things take a long time at the city, I can just tell you from experience that things are actually a little bit more nimble, and you have more opportunity to influence things all along the process than you do in, for example, in state government.
Okay, let's talk, and with apologies, Mr. Thomas, about a relatively wonky city issue, and which has come up already, which is this idea of notification and how we talk about things, and you know, when we have a piece of property like this, the Grove or the State Hospital or the Brackenridge tract, obviously it impacts a large segment of our community, and we have a sort of a very, some might call it robust, some might call it aggressive, some might not, way of sort of notifying people. And I think that some might argue that it's sort of unwieldy. Mr. Oliver, you see this, you know, your commission deals with this a lot. You want to talk a little bit about it, and
Sure.
And sort of what your thoughts are about it?
Yeah, I think at times the Planning Commission and probably other parts of our city government, you know, we have to deal with when we want to get into the weeds of talking about planning around a very specific area. You know, that's a public discussion. That's not a private discussion amongst planning commissioners or anything like that. That's a discussion where once you open that box, it's like, okay, you got to notify everybody within 500 feet of that property. And if you're talking about, say, a corridor like East Cesar Chavez, this has come up recently for us, or they want to deal with some very specific planning issues, it's like, okay, we want to talk about this area. We have no idea what we want to do with it. but there's concerns about, rapid growth and rapid change. Okay, so how do we talk about that? Well, in the case of proactively looking at a state piece of land, do we notify everybody on day one that we want to kind of brainstorm on this? And if so, there's city resources that, right now, we can't just go willy-nilly just say every piece of property in the city we want to go talk about, because we don't have the resources to talk about it. I mean, we're getting ready to go into Code Next, where first 9 months of next year, planning staff is going to be completely absorbed at dealing with, code and mapping issues for the entire city. While simultaneously, there may be very specific planning issues that need to come out of that. We've got to make sure we've got the planning staff with proper resources if we want to be proactive in the nature I think many of us want to be. So it doesn't do us any good to say we need to do this, but there's nobody there to pick up that baton. So that's we got to look at that from a budget standpoint and just and prioritize what is going to have the most meaningful impact in the shortest amount of time.
Your reaction to that, council member?
Yeah, I would agree, and I would also say that the city also needs to be nimble in shifting and changing so that conditions on the ground 10 years ago will naturally evolve and change, and so we need to be responding to conditions on the ground today. And that goes to things like during budget, where is the staffing? Do we give a slug of additional full-time employee slots to this, say, the permitting office, just as an example, because they have needs right now, but what about our code folks? We have compliance issues, so how are we attacking that? And then those are just two examples of the wide array of issues that we address at the city. And we always come up with the short stick. We just don't have enough resources to feed them out all the time at the levels that they need to be. So part of the difficulties in the budget process is trying to address at least as much as we can in each of those areas. When the council is going to have a policy retreat in January to kind of both welcome, we have a new council member coming on. And
at least one.
We have a runoff, so there may or may not be some changes there. So we will be bringing in the council in January to have some high-level conversations and kind of sort through things and see what direction we want to go. This year we had a retreat, and one of the top issues was homelessness, and that pushed the mayor's initiative that he carried over from the previous council on homeless veterans, and that was coming out of HUD. Secretary Castro was in town on that issue, and then the second phase of that is homeless youth. So we're trying to attack those specific issues, but they're by nature very kind of narrow.
So do you?
There's so many other things that we also have to address.
And I was going to say, so is it? I guess, could we look for a conversation that comes out of that retreat to focus on, we have Code Next coming, as Stephen says, at least the next 9 months of our lives. Can we focus, more than that, can we expect something from council on dealing with these issues?
I would expect so, but I don't expect it to be a decision on the content of it, because we won't yet have seen it or read it or even had a chance to digest it and then have the conversations and explanations and interpretations. The city will need to go through all of that as well, but it is absolutely on our radar, and more than our radar. Okay.
Let's talk a little bit about highest and best use. Mr. Thomas, you mentioned that, and I imagine the state is generally neutral on that idea when they divest themselves of a piece of land.
Well, I wouldn't say that. Well, in the instance of a divestiture, then I think that that's right.
Okay.
But we're constantly evaluating the properties for highest and best use, which is a critical element of what goes into our analyses associated with what to do with those properties. So before a sale, obviously not one of the things is if the highest and best use is to liquidate that property, is to remove it from the state's inventory, then I believe again that I wouldn't say that the state is, I'd say we are agnostic to what the use then becomes, because I believe at least that becomes appropriately in the purview of the local entity.
Sure.
Obviously, there would be no intent or no desire for a utilization of the property to harm. I mean, you wouldn't want that to be.
Of course.
But I think what is appropriate to say we'd be agnostic and then defer to the local entity, wherever they are in the state, to decide from a zoning perspective how they'd like to see that property developed.
Can you think of an example where the state has gotten involved post-sale about the idea of use? Is there? I throw that out there. I don't know of one. I'm curious.
Tangentially. So
Sure.
globally, no, but tangentially, the state was approached by Councilmember Poole and others about cooperating or coordinating with the potential utilization of property adjacent to the Grove, or more importantly, access issues. I thought that was absolutely appropriate.
Okay.
It's not specific to your question, but it's a good example of the way I think Councilmember Poole in specific coordinated an effort to reach out to the state very respectfully and very cooperatively and collaboratively to talk about whether there were utilizations on our adjacent property which would facilitate needs. And don't know the outcome of that yet, still doing an analysis, but it was a really appropriate way, I believe, for the city to reach out to the state and to open a dialogue.
Okay. Highest and best use, council member. Obviously, this is a subjective sort of thing in some ways, and one that is prone to argument setting. When you think about highest and best use, what are you thinking about?
Well, from the state's perspective, and the state goes through various phases of evaluating underutilized or unneeded land, whether to sell it, and then I think the policy discussions at the state level are once you've sold the land, then you never have it again, and you can't sell it for anything more than when
Right.
you've sold it there. There are some provisions in state law that give first right of refusal to municipalities.
Right.
So we have been offered some property in the past that we could purchase at a particular dollar figure. It's kind of like buying your car where there's no haggle, no hassle, right? So it's just that price.
Okay.
And we're also looking at properties with AISD and along the same lines where a price is set and then first right of refusal goes to that price. So as far as the highest and best use, when the state goes to sell their land, and Robert can correct me on this piece, but it generally is because they are needing to raise funds for a reason. And holding the land isn't as useful to the state anymore as would be divesting themselves of it. So they would, by the very nature of that transaction, be looking for the biggest dollar return that they can get.
Sure.
Now that legislation that I talked about kind of puts a damper on that,
Okay.
but that's only for the first right of refusal. After that, if there is no bid there, then it goes to a bid, and that's the open market, and those numbers can really escalate. So there's kind of a built-in benefit to the state for a municipality not to buy that land, but there's a built-in benefit to a municipality to buy that land because we can get valuable land for our purposes at a fair price, and then we have more control over what happens on that land, which is what happened at the Triangle, for example, in Miller, and not so much at the Grove, which was the regret that so many have about the land that was for sale for less than $30 million at the Grove, and then it was bought for over $45 million by the particular developer. So that's kind of that rub.
And I guess also thinking about highest and best use from your personal perspective, you make decisions about properties, most weeks. When I guess it depends on the property. I mean, what are you looking for? Are there general things that you look for when you're trying to make a decision about highest and best use?
Well, I evaluate each application that comes on its merits and where it is. I mean, location matters a lot, and what is the compatibility of the project that is being suggested for a particular place, and then what infrastructure, to Stephen's point, what infrastructure do we have to offer in place or that needs to be expanded or extended in order to serve the area. And so it really, for me, while I have some high-level kind of policy directions on it, they really run along those lines. Where are we with being able to serve that area? What else is around? Some of my colleagues look for as specific as, is there a grocery store? I'm interested in schools, so
Okay.
That kind of pairs up as well. Transit is an issue that tends to lag, as we know. Cap Metro is looking for the demand before they put a line out, and that's their policy decision. I'm not on Cap Metro. But that seems to be a reasonable way to go, generally. And then the compatibility with what is going to be built and where it is being proposed to be built. There are some proposals that may not be good in place A, but would be brilliant in place B.
Okay. Stephen, when you look at stuff at the Planning Commission, same basic deal?
For the most part, I'd say yes. I mean, a lot of the topics that Councilmember Poole just hit on would be ones that I would certainly echo. It is a context-based decision, and this is going to continue to come up. That you're going to hear that phrase probably at some point too much within the next year as we work through the remapping of the city. But we have an affordability problem. And you're not going to get, I mean, the affordable units are in Hutto, they're in Kyle, they're in Buda, they're not in Central City. Unless the land is free, there's no such thing as an affordable single-family home in Austin. With that in mind, and with increased traffic problems because people are coming, they're buying homes on the fringe and driving in, typically by themselves. How do you resolve that problem when you look at individual properties? Well, that individual property is not going to solve that problem, but it is part of a string of solutions that has to be on the table. If you don't make the most of that piece of property, a large piece of property, and these, for the most part, these are larger pieces of property, and you don't make the most of it at that point in time, and if you don't plan for it, 20 years from now, you might look at that piece of property and go, wow, we didn't do a lot with that for what it was at that point. Now, does that mean we should absolutely break the back of everything around it by dumping high-rises on every vacant piece of land? That's not what I'm saying at all, but I do think if you want to look at it from the highest and best use with respect to affordability, you can't be too passive with this. You have to be a little bold. Now, the question is, are we allowing those bold decisions to come with the other mechanisms with it that don't put the strain on every resident who's lived there for the last 20 years? But I do think, respectfully, we have to anticipate some significant level of change in a city that grows every night. I mean, we're not Cleveland, we're not St. Louis, we're not cities that have slow growth. So we have to respond in our own way, and at times it's going to hurt a little bit, in my opinion. But we got to be respectful as we go.
Can I
Please.
piggyback on something?
Yeah, please.
So from the state's perspective, I've heard very recently from someone I trust that the state is expected, I believe it's by 2050, to double in size. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about highest and best use from the state's perspective, we're also thinking about, literally from the state's perspective, what are the demands going to be on the state at that time and what are our needs going to be? We've recently, the legislature has recently approved, and the leadership has approved a capital complex master plan where we are in phase one of building 3 new buildings in the Capitol, the first building being across from the Bullock. It's literally recognizing that the cost to the state, as individual taxpayers, of having our employees in private properties is an extreme cost and escalating every year, particularly in Austin, what we spend on rent. The ability to recognize, the ability to forecast what of these properties might potentially serve, because we already own them, so that cost of purchasing the property no longer exists. And then it's identifying how those properties might be best utilized for the entirety of the state to minimize the economic impact from a tax burden perspective on the state. So I think both Stephen and Leslie had a really good points, and if you take those same concepts about affordability, anticipating needs in the future, the state is always thinking about. That's what we do when we update our facilities plan every 2 years to assess where we are and where the needs are. Mm-hmm. We have properties in downtown that are desperately needed for purposes of providing services needed today. Mm-hmm. And the Hobby Building, for example, is full of state employees providing critical needs. So many agencies are housed there. And where do they need to be vis-a-vis the key places that they interact with in order to provide their services? So we, again, at the 50,000-foot level, we have, as all Texans, we have similar issues. Maybe they're just a slightly different perspective, or a slightly different viewpoint or vantage point about what we're doing, but they're the same issues.
I'm sorry, please.
I had 2 points in following up to that. One is I think there is absolutely the pressing need for public-private partnerships in these. That if you look at whether it's state land or school property, look at all the dispersal of AISD properties around the city. Imagine if we were able to house teachers on the same property. We've got 10-acre or larger campuses and largely greenfield in sometimes semi to urban conditions. If people didn't have to drive from Kyle to teach at that school, what opportunities are we creating? I know that's an extreme vision for some people, but if state employees are able to benefit by living closer through the sale of a property to other state facilities, there might be a win-win from affordability as well as the benefit to the taxpayer in the long run is what the state is doing with its land. And secondly, I look at Austin's such a new city. I mean, we transitioned so quickly from urban conditions to suburban conditions right on the doorstep of downtown. That's fairly unique, but I think it's also it's unique and typical to the cities that grew post World War II, highway-dominated growth, and because of that, we have also a very immediate segregation between residential and the services we need to support those residential properties. So, compared to other cities, you go to San Antonio, every half mile you have a commercial street. In Austin, it's every mile plus you get another commercial street. So we force all of our commercial services to just a handful of major corridors in this town, and then we expect those corridors to do everything. So when Councilmember Poole talks about where's the closest grocery store, often it's a lot further than it should be if this was another city. And so these properties that we look at, they are an incredible opportunity for services we're kind of parachuting in services that maybe should have been there a long time ago had we developed more robustly over 100 years ago than we did. But Austin is the way it is, and so we've got to address it in the best way we can for today's growth.
Councilmember, please.
Well, and I'll just jump in there and give a shout out to the folks who currently live here who are trying to hold on to their homes, and as we expand and build, their property taxes increase because their property is worth more, and so I'm deeply concerned to ensure that they get to stay in their homes and are not leaving for Kyle and Buda and Pflugerville and so forth. So we have and that piece, we talk a lot about newcomers to Austin, but we talk not as much because I think people, policymakers, assume that the folks who live here already are being taken care of, and I'm not so sure that's the case.
Okay.
We talk specifically about seniors and how we want seniors certainly to be able to age out in their homes. Well, and there's the generation right before them who will be seniors, and so and then there are the public schools that are harmed if our families can't afford to stay in the neighborhoods and they have to move to other parts of Central Texas. So for me, we also have to shine a light on the people who are here and make sure that they can stay too. It's folks in this room. And then it's the pace of the change that I think should really be the conversation, because we will evolve, we will change, we will build more, but I would like to see the thickening of the fabric be more at a more generational pace. And then that allows everybody to kind of stay in alignment. It allows wages, that's a whole other topic, which have been stagnant for too long. And from my perspective, I still don't see a good reason for it, because interest rates are low, productivity is through the roof, you almost can't squeeze more productivity, and yet employers are laying off staff.
Sure.
So, not only have you proven you can do more, but now you're going to do the work of the two people who aren't there anymore. So, a generational pace that includes, so that everybody can stay with it, including wages really have to grow as well.
And from where I sit, it sounds like seems like there is a significant sort of high-level amount of planning that needs to happen, and of course we're about to do some of that. Mr. Thomas, you mentioned the Capitol Complex master plan. It seems like you guys have that handled from one perspective. The city is going to be the recipient of some of that because some of those facilities in that plan you'll sell.
I'm sorry, say again?
The city will be the recipient of some of that plan because some of those facilities will, I'm assuming here, will be sold at some point?
No.
No facilities?
No, this is the Capitol Complex Master Plan is the legislatively defined geographic region around the Capitol Complex, the Capitol itself, and going all the way north to to MLK.
Okay.
And so, no, that is, in fact, to the extent that the benefit to the state of owning that property is that we're not competing outside of that area for properties that I guess Leslie and Stephen
Gotcha.
are talking about. So it is the capital complex master plan anticipates the development and utilization, and in this instance, it's an historic appropriation of $1.2 billion, both for construction and deferred maintenance, to build buildings there to house our employees. So at least in theory, again, we're in early stages of phase 1. We're seeking approval for phase 2. But that will take pressure off of some of the properties that private properties that we're leasing that could potentially then be subject to all kinds of redevelopment. Again, those are private properties and those are private entities who have, their own ability to interact with their local government police. But to the extent that there were an opportunity to bring employees from a leased space, I don't know, off of Airport Boulevard, I'm not just guessing,
Yeah, sure.
in maybe a low rise and move that in, there is a property then there that would, once that occurs, that would give that private property owner the opportunity, particularly under Code Next, to figure out how do I optimize my utilization of this property in a way that facilitates the needs that Steve and Leslie are talking about. How do I contribute in a productive way to creating affordability and effective revitalization?
And I think this brings us to this point about planning. We're about to do Code Next. At the end of Code Next, there will be some result, good, bad, whatever. When we're talking about a piece of property like the Grove, I think some might argue that sort of trying to zone it, though these are the circumstances you're dealt, sort of piecemeal makes for a very difficult conversation. You want to talk about that, trying to figure out how these pieces fit into the larger city plan?
I think a missing step that we've got to focus a lot of energy on, and certainly I don't think it's going to happen while we look at the code language that we're about to work through. I think it'll be touched on when we're working on the mapping, but the mapping, from what I understand from staff, is not per se planning. It's translating old code language to new code language, old zoning information to new zoning language, and it is in full respect of what is on the ground today. There is planning work that I think is going to be immediately apparent to everybody in the room that will need to be the follow-up to that. That just because we're going to remap the city doesn't mean we're not going to look at portions of the city immediately after that. It's not like, oh, we're done with our rezoning work. Okay, we won't touch those properties for another 5 years. We won't touch that node at, Cameron and Dessar or whatever it might be. We have to look at the notion that we established 5 years ago with Imagine Austin of complete communities. The language is all there for us. What we need to do is establish metrics that there are performance indicators that are going to come out in the middle of next year, in the middle of the Code Next effort that's going to say, in 2012, you had 20 of these, and now in 2016, you have 50 of these across the city. Okay, we have 30 more. What does that mean? And we haven't done that analysis. And this is the first time we've been through these planning exercises, which is kind of funny and scary to me all at the same time. So we need that analysis of that information needs to play into a planning conversation of, do we want more of that? Do we want less of that? And it can't exist at a neighborhood plan level. And it can't exist at the 30,000-foot Imagine Austin level, at the comp plan. It's got to be looking at areas of the city grouped together. Does this part of the city meet all the needs of the community that we have established are important through our complete community framework? And if it's saying this part of the city is extremely affordable, but it doesn't have any of these things, okay, unique solutions may need to come out of large properties that are on that table at that time. Or if this part of the community is terribly expensive, the land, people would look at it and go, well, it looks like it's going to be a lot more expensive housing going into it. Well, maybe we've got to look at the solutions from a planning perspective differently as well. Otherwise, we're just perpetuating the same development criteria and solutions we've done for the last 30 years, and why would expect anything different? But we can't do it like that, so we've got to get proactive, and we need the resources to make it happen.
Michael, Real quick, I just want to piggyback. Remember that state employees are our neighbors. State employees, there may be some in this room, or certainly everybody in this room knows them. So we're talking about the very same Austinites or people who are forced to live in other surrounding communities because of these same issues. I think what Stephen said is powerful. And I wanted to bring that from, I guess, potential, or partially with my state hat on, when I think of it from, how do we, which is our job, how do we facilitate optimizing state properties for the benefit of the state by providing service, allow our agencies to provide services. Even if the state, and Leslie was awesome, she brought a map of all the various local or public entities' properties across the region, the Central Texas region, or Austin, Greater Travis County region. And I'm looking at all of the state properties. And even if, in theory, the state were, again, hypothetically speaking, were to make all of these pieces of property available immediately or over a period of time that made sense for local governmental entities to optimize the development of those, it still wouldn't solve the core fundamental issues that Stephen's talking about. What I guess I'm trying to say is we should never look at the city of state properties as a panacea. A sale of, the potential sale of property, should the legislature and the leadership decide that that is their wish, could certainly be a part, but it would be an infinitesimally small part of the solution that I think Leslie and Stephen work on every single day. As a resident, I'm significantly concerned, and I know that our panel is focused on state-city relations in this regard, but we have other large tracts of land that aren't state or publicly owned, which are also not, if we disregard the Grove, but the Austin Oaks PUD application in Northwest Austin, which is now central. When I moved there, I thought we were far northwest, according to the people that, but now I learned that we're actually very central and right across the street from my neighbor, the highway from my neighbor. But the point is, when we talk about Imagine Austin, if I have my state hat on and I realize, or I become aware that the leadership policy decision is to liquidate a particular piece of property, I want to know that our local leadership and our local planning process is going to utilize that property optimized for the benefit of the community. If it results in a tremendous amount of traffic, if it destroys the character of a community, we're going to develop, and we should encourage development, but we shouldn't do it, again, this is very personally speaking, we shouldn't do it at the expense of what Austin is. It doesn't create affordability. I think that that's commonly understood now. But most importantly, I guess the point is, as a resident and the ability to sit at this table for at least a little bit with two people who are critically important in this process, I wonder whether or not we really do have a planning process that works. I wonder whether or not we really do have envisioning that works. Imagine Austin, some in my community in Northwest Hills believe failed because the PUD application arguably doesn't remotely contemplate what that geographic area was identified for development would be under Imagine Austin. I understand that there are conflicting opinions on that, and I respect other people's views. But my point is, going back from a state perspective, I think I would hope, and it would not be inappropriate that the leadership would not scold me for saying that we would want to make sure that that property that was liquidated or removed from the rolls of the state ownership, that was utilized in a way that was optimized for the benefit, the longer term benefit of the community. Because at the end of the day, those properties developed go back on a tax roll and are critically important to local and state and federal health for having a healthy tax base. So it's critically important from the state's perspective that those properties are utilized, even though it's the local entity's responsibility to determine what that looks like, but it needs to be optimized for the global health of the citizens. And I think that's a critical point that's appropriate for the chair of the Facilities Commission to maybe point out.
Sure, absolutely. And I want to get you to I want to get your response to that, certainly, council member. But I want you to elaborate a little bit on that because, you've said so far that it's really important for the local policymakers to make that policy. It seems in that case that the state does have some interest in what the policy is.
Well, I think from the perspective that the state is not some amorphous global entity, but it's made up of people like me, like all of us sitting in this room, who all share the same goals. We all want to be able to move. From a state's perspective, honestly, we have to be able to get our employees to our office buildings to be able to perform their functions. They have to have access to childcare so that they don't have those fears when they're trying to perform their highest and best service to the citizens of the state of Texas. They have to have access to, they can't be in the middle of food deserts, as I think has been referenced here. So from that perspective, we're all human beings. We want the same thing. It's the difficulty of figuring out how to achieve that. So yes, I'll say from at least a theoretical perspective, the state recognizes that the development from the highest and best use, as determined by the local government entity, will benefit the state long term. But I think it's also critical that we recognize that, and I believe that it's a strong belief, certainly of our governor and other leadership, and quite frankly, probably all 181 legislators, that those local control issues are best handled at the state, at the local level. I promise you, just before we came up, Leslie was teasing me about the breadth and depth of the things as a council member she's responsible for versus what I ended up with at the Facilities Commission. And while I thought that my responsibility was broad, she's right. But if you, I teasingly tell people when they ask me questions, I say, you know, this is a really critical issue, but I promise you that the governor, and by extension the speaker and the lieutenant governor, this is a very small issue and a global issue, the global issues that they have to deal with daily on running the state. So it's not that it's not important, but it's probably critically important to recognize that there are others better suited and best suited to make utilization issues, and it's better for us to not get drug into and separate that.
I gotcha. Council member, want to go ahead?
Yeah, and I was ruing the days when I could focus like entirely on just one topic for years at a time, and which was kind of the conversation that Robert and I were having, and now, you know, we have a rush of issues coming at us constantly. There's two things I'd like to say about our friends in state government. You know, one of the reasons why Austin has been able to manage the ebb and flow of the economy and recessions and depressions has been the fact that the two things that kept Austin going here up until about 2000 or maybe 90, 95 were state government and the University of Texas. And we were able, through the solid kinds of salaries that were being paid, the predictability and certainty of those jobs, generally speaking, they kept Austin going at times when the economy was crashing. And I'm thinking about the 80s in particular. And then again at 9/11, and then the last recession, we had the Great Recession toward the end of the 2000s. So we need to recognize, I think, the importance of retaining and sustaining our state government jobs. They pay, you know, they could be better wages, but they're livable wages, and they're wages that the middle class has had kids and raised families on and bought homes and made do and made good lives for themselves and have really peopled this city. The boom that we've had has added to the diversity of the industries that we have here, and that was a specific goal of previous councils, and specifically Mayor Watson. And I had the privilege to serve on two different appointed committees that he was involved in. One in particular was the Downtown Development Advisory Group, which came up with the idea of the Waller Tunnel, for one thing. And then he was real concerned in the late 90s with making sure we had more residents living downtown. So his goal at the time was 3,000, and I think I know, that's kind of funny. It seemed really a big goal at first, and it was actually because shortly after that happened, we had 9/11, and we had to crawl out of that. But we have, I think, over 10,000 residents living downtown. I think I read or saw that somewhere, and someone in the audience can probably correct me on that. But the point being that the goal of 3,000 has been met and surpassed. So there's a lot to be said about making sure that our friends who work in state government stay here and also at UT. And then the other point I would make is that every time you put a parcel, and I'd be happy to share this map, every time we put a parcel of state-owned land back on the tax rolls, then that also helps us here with our general revenue. It helps the state with taxes. And so to the extent that they're consolidating folks, and this has been a conversation at the state capitol for decades, really, the vision of having that area of town be the campus for state government.
Yeah.
So I think that the points that Robert brings up are good ones.
Okay, please.
Quick comment on what Robert was talking about with Austin Oaks being viewed by some as, as a failure of Imagine Austin. And it reminded me of some recent conversations at the Planning Commission where I've asked staff and some of the other planning commissioners, like, how do we feel about individual properties being weighed against Imagine Austin itself? Because the problem we get into is if you're for a development, if you're against a development, you can find something in Imagine Austin that supports it, and or that makes it wrong. And then if you are on the losing side, then you go, well, Imagine Austin's not for me. Obviously, that its goals are not my goals. And I think we are putting a undue amount of weight on Imagine Austin on an individual case basis, on an individual property basis. And I think it was very much, it was a smart idea, it was a noble idea when we first started, once Imagine Austin was adopted, we want to figure out, how many ways can we use this thing? And so here we got cases coming to us every other week, to both commissions, so every week, that we're going, does this, what in this development plan is supported by Imagine Austin? So staff, can you help us with this? And staff, check, no. Whatever that process truly looks like, they put thought into it. But the problem is, as I just said, it can be argued either way. What really truly matters, I think, is a collection of properties in a part of town over an extended period of time. Over a year, what happened in Northeast Austin with all these rezonings? Does it push us towards this as a collective so that is the market and our zoning and our vision, are all those kind of aligning? Because every single property cannot, as you said, one property cannot do it. One state parcel is not going to make Imagine Austin happen. And so don't put that expectation on it. We'll lose, and somebody will be upset and say, well, the Austin vision is not my vision. And it starts to fracture us as a community where we should be supporting the victories we got out of that development, maybe wishing we had a little bit more or a little bit more protection or, whatever it might be that is your passion. So I think we need to be really careful with it. And I'm at the Planning Commission level, I'm going to continue to encourage us to stop using Imagine Austin as we're using it right now. We've got to I want to look at all the cases together over a period of time and go, now what does this mean? Because that's more helpful to me.
Well, the difficulty, and I respect that, but the difficulty with that is, for example, when I talk about the failure of the planning process, the global, which I know we're trying to address through Code Next, but very few neighborhoods in Austin actually were able to go through the neighborhood planning process.
Absolutely.
And in fact, many of the neighborhoods outside of the urban core, but are central city neighborhoods, never even had the opportunity because they didn't have the political clout to push through to request that they be planned. So I actively participated as the vice president of my neighborhood association, Northwest Austin Civic Association. I was on it for 5 years. Quite frankly, I think we were fairly oblivious to even that opportunity, which tells us that we probably should have been more proactive. My point about Imagine Austin is not necessarily that it in and of itself failed, but the question of how the city, whether it is on a greenfield or a redevelopment like Austin Oaks, how is it going to take, because I agree with you, globally we have to look at wins across a period of time, but how are we going to enact Imagine Austin, and how are we going to, quite frankly, not set up our council members for, meaning coming through your process, when it finally gets to their desk, their dais, literally, how do we make sure that we have been, right now what we have is Imagine Austin, how do we ensure that what lands on their desk, on their dais, is as consistent with the concept, the construct of, and my point was only thinking about height issues.
Yeah.
When I'm going to get it wrong, you'll be able to clarify for me, but that area in Northwest Hills is considered, particularly along Mopac, I believe was considered a town center or it was
Either a neighborhood center or town center.
a neighborhood. I think it was
I bet neighborhood center.
So there were, in other words, it set a good guideline for constructs of what made sense, consistent with an Imagine Austin. My point is, and of course nothing's ever black and white, but my point is when it goes through your commission and the other commissioners, environmental commissions, and it lands on the desk of, and all of the politics associated with that, don't get me wrong, I support the redevelopment, the healthy, smart, intelligent redevelopment of that property to benefit our city, our tax bases, new neighborhood, new grocery stores, new whatever is going to bring restaurants, park space, because we have a lack of that in the Northwest area. But my point is, when I stop and think about it as a resident, let alone as the chair of the Texas Facilities Commission, how a property is going to be utilized, and we think about highest and best use, if you've got a construct that is supposed to dictate and guide that, how do we ensure that what ends up on the dais for our council members to decide on, that we really can? Because what I've seen is the staff struggling mightily and the commissioners struggling mightily on a case-by-case basis, and the Austin Oaks PUD and the Bull Creek, or the Bull Creek property in particular, to figure out what that looks like. And so I wasn't meaning to detract from this construct.
I completely agree with everything you just said. I think one critical aspect that we need to put increased effort into is, the growth concept map that you may be kind of loosely referring to. In Imagine Austin, if you don't know, there's a map in there. It's a growth concept map, and it's got particular roads highlighted. It's got particular intersections with a circle on it, and that's where we want to focus our growth. And they've got different labels, and they range from regional center all the way down to neighborhood center. And those have different growth metrics assigned to them. A neighborhood center at the intersection, what we haven't done is put enough differentiation of what does a neighborhood center look like at the intersection of a major roadway and a highway, and what does a neighborhood center look like closer to the heart of a neighborhood. Those are not the same thing, but maybe some communities want them to be the same thing, but we haven't had that conversation, because right now everything on that, from that title, neighborhood center, and the dots, they're all behaving the same way once you get into a conversation about redevelopment. And we need to take that a step further and say, there are different kinds of neighborhood centers. And we can, I think that will help the conversation. The second part of it is the two most controversial cases in the last year, Austin Oaks and the Grove, neither of them went to the Planning Commission. And I'm not saying we figure out everything right. I'm not saying we get it right every time.
You don't?
I know. We try, and not detracting from the Zoning and Planning Commission at all, but I think historically, Planning Commission has dealt with the most contentious cases in the city. And granted there's turnover and we're not all the same faces, but sometimes maybe we've got a little bit more experience at the really, really tough planning commissions related to neighborhood planning conversations and Imagine Austin conversations. Zoning and planning, they don't deal with neighborhood plans. And so to all of a sudden introduce all the language and the ideas of what is in a neighborhood plan to commissioners who don't have to deal with that, we're asking people to almost speak a little bit different language and expect the same results out of the conversation. And I don't think that's fair to ZAP, because ZAP does a great job. I don't know. Austin's weird. We got two commissions doing the same thing. It's just, where are you? But that's what we've got. And until we choose to change that, we might need to tweak some of the larger PUDs or the state land process, unzoned land process, to go, if this is a large parcel in the city, regardless if it's in a neighborhood plan, shouldn't they all go to the same body? I think most people would say yes.
And I'm afraid we're going to have to leave that hanging there, because I do want to leave at least a little bit of time for questions from the audience here. Unless, council member, you can give like a 30-second response, if you got a 30-second response to what?
Yes.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. And the other important thing about those commissions is, and you touched on it, is the experience of the individual commissioners who were assigned there. I had the fortune of having spent many years as a commissioner on a variety of different commissions at the city, and there's definitely a hierarchy. Some of them are easier draws than others. Some of them are really, really technical. Water Wastewater Commission, for example, is super technical. And the two land development commissions really, those appointees are asked to do a lot as volunteers, and it was important to me to put people on both of those who had background and who had expertise and who had served previously. It was a very strategic and very definitive decision on my part when I made my appointments to various boards and commissions, having had some of that experience myself. And those two commissions, I think, are right at the top of the list of the ones that are so much is called upon. It's all thankless. But they don't even have the benefit of being music commission where they can go to shows. You know, so,
Well, we don't get a cup of coffee.
man, we got to do something about no coffee.
Not that I'm asking.
So out there, I think Melissa's running around with a microphone. David King.
Thank you. And Mr. Thomas, I really appreciate your comments. And Councilmember Poole, I'm one of those state employees that had the opportunity to work with the state. That was my career. And, you know, the state has been really good to me, and so has the city, and this is very important to me. And so I appreciate your comments, but in the points about neighborhood planning and the challenges there. So we have these issues with, you know, bottom-up neighborhood planning. We have the comprehensive plan that's coming up for a 5-year major review. And I think your points, Commissioner Oliver, are important about retrospectively looking back and seeing how has it worked, how we've tried these things, how have they worked, and let's that inform these major amendments that we need to make, we may need to make. But my major point is we've got Code Next coming out, which is going to be, you know, change the lay of the land, so to speak, for us for generations, decades to come. And then we've got the major 5-year amendments that we need to look at for Code Next. And then we've got these neighborhood plans. So how do we converge all those together? And then, you know, at the same time that we have the state with properties around, and we've got the Austin State Hospital that's in the queue that may be one of our next PUDs. And and when it comes to PUDs, it's like, oh, you know, it's just a negotiation. Yes, we have all these plans that we can look at, but really, all the rules are open now. We can go renegotiate anything if we want to. So that's the scary thing about PUDs, is that despite that we have the zoning, and despite that we have the plan, the comprehensive plan, we can negotiate all those things again. So I think that's the unsettling part of PUDs. So I wonder, in the new code, are we going to have PUDs, and will we need PUDs? And secondly, how do we converge all these efforts together so that they leverage each other? And make sure, and what is the state's involvement in that? I think it's really critical that the state has a role in these planning processes. Thank you.
Let's go left to right here. Mr. Oliver.
We do have an incredible amount of work coming before us in the next year. You know, from the text itself, the text is going to be, we hope it establishes a better process. I mean, if the process is the same, as the consultant will say, if you're running new software on the same old computer, doesn't matter. You know, so we've got to fix our process at the same time. But when we get into the weeds of text mapping, and again, from what I understand, mapping is not going to be per se what we think of as planning. So we need to set our expectations as to, okay, well, if it's not planning, then what is it? Is it just relabeling and all that kind of stuff? Or are there certain policies that are being enacted through the relabeling? And that's a conversation that the consultant and staff are going to have to work us through. And I don't know the answers to that. I wish I did right now. It'd make me feel better. So I'm sure this, as a community really wants to know as well. In dealing with the 5-year update, I feel that we're going to get information out of the tracking of what has Austin been like the last 5 years, what changes have been in play. We're going to get that information while the mapping is getting close to wrapping up at the Planning Commission, and then the map is going to go to council, the text is going to go to council. But at the same time, we're going to get this analysis of what's happened in the last 5 years in Austin. I think that's going to establish a parking lot of information that we need to work through to go, okay, what play are we going to run next? Not let's try to run every play at once. You know, this is the next down. What's the most appropriate thing we need to do? And call the right play. Because what we know is we don't have all the resources to do what we need. So we need to make sure that unless we're going to double staff, that we do the next appropriate steps for the information that's on the table. And I think that's a full conversation between council, Planning Commission and staff to say, do we have the right planning steps organized? Because to be honest, I think for the last 5 years, we haven't run all the implementation steps in the correct order. Not to say we're not running the right steps, but I don't think some things feel out of sequence to me. There were conversations we were supposed to have before we got to this point, from what I have read, that says we were supposed to have discussed the different areas' expected level of change with the community. We haven't had that conversation. So if you don't know what we think we're supposed to be like, we have great community character analysis. Staff and consultant did an amazing job cataloging different parts of the city. What we don't have is those visions for the other 60% of the land in the city that is not in a neighborhood plan. And granted, a lot of our neighborhood plans are 20 years old. So future land use maps as part of those wouldn't exactly be future land use maps anymore. They're more like current land use maps. Okay, so what is the next 20 years supposed to be like, as opposed to fighting it on a case-by-case basis? So parking lot of information, let's take it step by step through it and do it in the immediate year after. Again, this is not, in my opinion, from what I can tell, this is not a one-time surgery on ourselves. We got in a massive car wreck. Our leg is shattered as a community. The first operation is going to be so that we can walk, and then we need some rehabilitation. And that's the year after.
Councilmember.
It'll take time, and I think that the community has to be ready for that and to have the patience that it will take, because these conversations are never easy and are never simple. And you may think you have arrived at a solution or a resolution, and then the next day you hear from some other folks who didn't know that that meeting was happening, and they're writing to you because they heard about it. We have to be open to that as well, which is not to say that we're never going to get to the end. We will. I just want to kind of set the stage and the expectations that when we get to this time next year, doesn't mean that everything is going to be already defined and refined and complete and ready to roll. It won't be. And so if there were one takeaway I would say to everybody is, it will be really interesting. You should totally engage with it because you will learn so much about your community. You may think you know various parts of town, but there's all kinds of other things that are out there that you can learn about, and that one of the reasons everybody loves Austin is this city gives you the ability and the opportunity to put yourself into any issue that you want to for as long and as deep as you want. We put down roots in many ways. Some of it is just in the schools or our job. Some of it is in the civic engagement that we have. That's why when people come to Austin, they want to stay here. And that's when we talk about losing the unique character of Austin, which I worry about every day too. I have comfort knowing that a lot of the community character comes from our community characters, which is us, which is the people. And so when people ask me, what is it that you like the most about Austin? It is always and ever will be the people who live here. And so that's why I rely on the input that I get from folks, primarily, of course, from my district, but I'm listening to people all around the city and in the county as well. And then the nature of my job is also to talk with colleagues and counterparts in other areas around the state and, frankly, everywhere I can, and bring back those ideas so that when we talk about innovation and creativity here in Austin, some of it is native, some of it is authentic and genuine because it's just here and it's us, but we do bring it in from all points around the globe. And I think especially now with changes at the national level, that we need to act locally and to the best of our abilities to ensure our quality of life here, because this is where we can make the change and it will resonate here. This may be the only place that we can make positive change, but I will fight to the end to ensure that you can here, even if things are closed off to us elsewhere, which I hope they won't be, but I have to acknowledge that we are operating in the larger construct as well. So I'm going to fight to retain what's important and special and unique about Austin.
Mr. Thomas.
Very briefly, David, I'm not, because of wonderful people like you, who your civic engagement, your passion, your collaboration, your kindness, so long as this community has people like you who engage in the process, we're going to be just fine. From a state's perspective, when the governor appointed me, I was told, you have deep, strong roots in the community. We'd like you to use them. And so my commitment to you and to all Austinites is certainly what I made to the governor, and that is any invitation that is to be extended to me to participate in a positive way to get the state engaged in the process while respecting the local government's rights and areas. I'm happy to be there, and I'm happy to bring my relationships to the table, and hopefully it'll be a positive assistance for the hard work that our local leadership is doing.
Sir.
Yeah, you've all kind of touched on it, and I guess, but when the rubber hits the road and you get down to some of these surplus decisions, how do you define community? Is it, you've all kind of touched on it. Is it macro, micro, within 500 feet, the people that get noticed? I mean, how do you define it, and how do you reconcile that in your decision making?
Mr. Oliver. Oh, please.
I was just going to
Councilwoman.
jump in and say they're concentric circles, and they ebb and they flow. And you know that in your personal life, you may focus close on this today, but tomorrow you're going to take a broader view. Point is, for me at least, to be open to all of it and to recognize when things are shifting into a different location, and just to absorb as much information as I possibly can.
When we have a zoning case come forward that, let's say the neighborhood association is in support of it, but the immediate 5 neighbors around it are upset. It creates an interesting dynamic in the room. I mean, it's like, well, are we going to ignore the people most immediately impacted by it? And when I say ignore, maybe it's like just recommending to council to deny it. We're not ignoring it. In those scenarios, you have that, then you'll have the flip side, where it's like the neighborhood association is completely opposed to it, but the people who live next door don't care so much. And so you get into, sometimes you're dealing with issues of precedent, sometimes you're dealing with issues of consistency of decisions, sometimes it's not in my backyard, sometimes it's not my front yard. I think we have to exercise the best judgment we can that we're minimizing harm, maximizing potential. And there is no perfect answer to what is the community, but I do think we need to continue to do a better job at defining the community's expectations for change. And to truly think, this is not a static place. This is a dynamic place. What could this look like in 20 years if we did nothing? I guarantee it's still different. So what are we going to do if we do something? So let's focus on those somethings.
Mr. Thomas.
My perspective of community is very similar. I think it is concentric circles, but I'd say my circle becomes statewide. When I and the Facilities Commission is charged, specifically the Facilities Commission is charged with doing an analysis of a piece of property to be able to make a recommendation to the leadership in the legislature. Our community outreach is, it looks at the geographic region adjacent to the property, but most importantly, it also looks to the constituents that are utilizing or benefit or for the reason that that property exists. And so that may have us, particularly, for example, just pick a Texas School for the Deaf or Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired. Both of those facilities, both of those agencies are recognized as worldwide leaders in providing education, cutting-edge education to people, and they're not just Austin residents. These are resident schools. We have primarily residents from the state of Texas across the state of Texas. So our community, when it comes to talking about whether we're going to identify a property as surplus, whether we're going to revitalize that property, rebuild on that property, necessarily has to take into account a much greater geographic and population. So our community is the state of Texas. I know that's self-explanatory, but
I think we got time for one more. Let's go, Mr. Cantu there.
Is it on? Okay. Thank you all for being here on a rainy Saturday. My question is specifically for Councilmember Poole. You mentioned earlier that your intent is not necessarily to stop development, but rather to manage it in a way that proceeds along a trajectory that's more of a generational pace. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, and I'll give you an example from my personal experience that you can respond to. So I live in a single-family home 10,000 square foot lot less than a mile from downtown that was built in 1962. My grandparents lived in it before I did. What one is allowed to develop on that piece of property has not changed over the course of multiple generations. So do you think that that is appropriate, that level of stasis?
It sounds to me like that decision has rested with your family. Didn't you say that that's where you have lived and where you live now?
Yeah, I was saying that what one is allowed to build on that piece of property, the regulations.
Oh, okay.
Microphone, come back.
Sorry, I was just saying that what one is allowed to build and develop on that property, the regulations governing the zoning and what have you, have not been allowed to change, have not changed since that structure was built. And now it's in a very, it's in the urban core, it's a very desirable neighborhood. But it hasn't changed over the course of multiple generations. Is that the type of generational change that you're envisioning?
And tell me your name.
My name's Andy Cantu.
Well, I would come back to ask you, is that what your family had desired? Because if you had desired to change it, then would you have gone to the city to change the zoning or to change what you could build there or to find out what all you could put there? And I don't want to take a case by case, because that's not really fair, and I don't know where you're located or what is located around it, but I would come back to say that if you are in a neighborhood with a neighborhood plan, there would have been some agreements within your neighborhood about what the neighborhood would look like. There are compatibility issues that transcend me and the council that planning and urban principles look at, and so I would just leave it there. I don't know how to answer your specific situation because I don't know where your property is or what all has governed it. But I will also say that the city does have the ability, the code is flexible. We do variances all the time. We see historic designation put on or not put on. We see homes demolished. We see homes demolished at a pretty high rate these days. So I think the answer to your question is more site-specific, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that offline. Thank you.
Well, maybe you can elaborate on, maybe attaching a, temporal dimension to what you mean by generation.
Be happy to talk to you about that offline, Andy. Thank you.
But taking that to the 50,000 foot level, and again, I know that but the 50,000 foot level, I think what's critically important about that goes back to one of the things I think Steve spoke very eloquently about, and that is the flexibility, the viability, the organic nature or the lack thereof of the construct, the development construct that we have in the city, and all of this pressure we're putting on Code Next, and I think Steve talked beautifully about the process that's going to be. As a fellow Austin resident, I wonder, the city came out and did some sewer work on my property. Not my property, my neighbor's property, but because of that, they had to destroy my driveway. I was told it's going to be 8 months before the city will come out and repair that. And then I was told, you know what, we're probably not going to do the job, and we're going to cut a line here, and it's not going to look right. You might as well go ahead and just my point of talking about that was I brought 3 contractors in, and all of them have said, this is too small. The headache and the time I'm going to have to spend to try to get the permits to fix the driveway that the city destroyed. So when I put that to the 50,000 foot level, and I don't think that that's fair to let that sit on Leslie or Steve's shoulders, but I think the question that I heard you talking about, that I care about as a chairman of the Facilities Commission, is the utilization of any property. Do we have a process that makes people angry, or that it facilitates resolution? Because maybe to end it from this perspective, we are state employees or state appointed officials, and we have concerns when we read the Statesman and we read the news about the explosions on the Austin Oaks PUD or the Grove, and the idea that the city may have difficulties managing its own processes and procedures overlaid on a very inclusive process that is so welcoming for all the feedback. The last thing that I want to do as a state-appointed official is get myself drug into a local issue that's going to explode, where my governor, my lieutenant governor, my speaker, our lieutenant governor, speaker, and our legislators, they have no ability to impact that, but they get the finger pointed at them. That, I think, at the 50,000 foot level, not to hijack your question, but to put it in a way that might be more than productive that our local officials can talk about is what is the process they can do to make that redevelopment process easier, even for the state to engage in.
I think this gives you the last word if you want it, Mr. Oliver.
I think that question ties well to the whole issue of expected level of change, and that if you don't have the right infrastructure in place, change is really, really painful. And whether it's for the community around it or for yourself. And we have so many cases where we kind of hit this wall in our conversation of, well, don't let that happen. There's already, like, let's say it's Rainy Street. Don't let the last tower in, because look at all the traffic that's here. What about the tower that came before that? And before that, like, and if we don't pick up the baton of let's implement some of the solutions that we can implement on that property and do it now, or on that district, and do it now rather than, wait another 5 years for 3 more towers to go in. The only thing we're doing is breeding this discontentment that change is bad, and that we want all this growth to happen on our corridors. We say that in our policies. We want growth to happen where it has access to services. But if we don't get our act together, and I think we are, I really do. I think the bond is going to help. I think there's other things that we're getting smarter at this. If we don't start putting in the infrastructure to support the growth, then we're just going to. There is no right level of change. It's all bad to those who have lived there for a considerable amount of time, because they don't see the benefit per se of what that growth brought to that area today. And maybe they'll be gone in 10 years when really the benefits of that growth truly come to play, when the pieces start to come together. So we've got to get ahead of this, and it's hard when we're such a reactionary city. And why are we reactionary? Because we grow so darn fast. And so we've got our work cut out for us, but there's people working on it. That's all I can say.
We'll end it there. Thank you all so much. Please be back at 1:15 for our annexation panel, and then at 2:30 we've got a great school finance panel. So enjoy your lunch, talk to each other. That's what this is about. And thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Good job. Thank you, sir.